Welcome back to another episode of the Dr. SuperCoach YouTube. You're on again with Pig, and I'm here to look to help you find some good vice captain or captain picks for round 12. Recapping last week, it was a bit of a roller coaster. There were 4 huge scores, but there was a lot of mediocrity last week, a lot of kind of players underperforming. If you took my advice last week and captained either Max Gawn or Jordan Dawson, you would have been licking your lips. That would have absolutely given you a bit of a rankings boost. But those of us that use Bont, Ryan or Dacos, you also would have been happy with a 130. Remember, a 130, it is a great captain score. I saw some people being upset that they didn't save it and wait for Gawn or Dawson, but don't be upset that someone else got an 80 when you've locked in a 130. You're going to take a 130 every day of the week. For me, I did go VC Ryan and Gawn was going to be C, so I was in that boat. I'm happy with that 132. I'm not too worried. I did predict Gawn to be my top scorer, but I'm not going to risk a 132 on that. This week's actually looking like it's going to be a really tough one for our captain's choices. There are some of our big premiums on the bye, and the ones that are playing, a lot of them have some tough matchups. So I think this is going to be a week where I try and have a crack at 2 safe 120s rather than shooting for the moon. I know before I've talked about vice captaining your highest player, hoping they go for that 150 and then finding a safe 120 back. If you've got someone you think will do that, still do it. But I don't think there's not many players I'm projecting that could get around 150 this week. I'm seeing a lot of kind of these 120s, so let's just have a crack at a couple of 120s. This week, if you do get a 120 VC, I would suggest taking it. I think don't muck around this week. You could be stung. Now, let's get into it. Let's get in the round 12 recommendations. My number 3 vice captain is Zach Butters. Zach's in some nice form lately. He's averaging 128 over his last 4 games. But it must be noted that those were against 4 of the easiest teams for inside midfielders to score against. This week, he plays against the conundrum that is Carlton. As I said last week, Carlton were the hardest team for midfielders to score against in their first 5 games, and then they became the easiest team for midfielders to score against in the 5 games after that. Then, last week, they went back to being really restrictive. I have no idea what's going on here. Someone in Dr. SuperCoach Slack pointed out that the data does correlate to when Pitnet plays or when he misses, but I struggle to see how that could cause one way or the other. I'm not really sure. I was trying to put it down to Walsh playing, pushing Hewitt and Kennedy out of the middle and being less restrictive. But, they were still really restrictive last week with Walsh playing, so I don't really know what the cause is right now. But what I'm trying to say is that this could be a great matchup for Zach, or it could be a really hard matchup for Zach. And I just haven't worked out what makes Carlton loose or restrictive. But what I do know is that Butters is one of the game's great midfielders, and he has a SuperCoach ceiling that not many can claim. As a result, he's always a fine vice captain option. I'm not really in love with this choice just because I don't know what Carlton are going to do in terms of restrictiveness. But as you'll see as I go through, it's a week of just trying to find a safe 120, which I think Zach can do even against hard opponents. So safe VC there. Number 2 option is Marcus Bontempelli. I just talked about looking for a safe 120 this week. Well, Bontempelli is usually a safe 120. 4 out of his last 6 have been 125 plus, and the 2 that weren't were against the hardest teams for inside midfielders. This week he plays against Collingwood. That isn't easy in itself. The Pies are actually the 6th most difficult over the last 5 games, so it's not like he's suddenly getting an easy matchup. It's still going to be difficult. But we can look at his last 2 games against Collingwood, which netted him scores of 123 and 125. Combine that with his last 3 games at Marvel Stadium this year, where he's averaging 134. That should give us some confidence that the Bont should be able to net us a score that we're happy taking. And here, I don't normally give you more than one option at a time, but I do think it's worth mentioning that if you want to look at a defender against Collingwood, Bailey Dale is a genuine VC option in this game too, because the Pies are one of the best matchups for defenders over the last 5 games. So, we just targeted Luke Ryan because of that reason. So Bailey Dale's an option as well. He's not really kind of the safe one like I think Bont or Butters is. He could go off for the 140, but he could also be average. So that's it for your consideration. Then my number one VC option is Nick Dacos. I feel like Nick is still somehow flying under the radar. He's got a 5-round average of 132, and he hasn't gone over 100 since round 2. I guess maybe he's just flying under the radar a bit because he's quite heavily owned and there's no need to talk about someone that everyone has. But he just scored 130 points against Fremantle, who at that time were the hardest matchup for inside midfielders. This week he faces the Bulldogs, who are middle of the pack in that category. So, a neutral matchup for inside midfielders. Dacos scored 69 points against the Bulldogs as a rookie, and then he scored 139 when he played them last year. He's only 2 meetings, so that's not much data. So let's have a look at venue. Nick plays at Marvel Stadium. He's only played there once this year. He scored a 147, albeit that was against West Coast with no Elliot Yeo. Last year, he only played at Marvel twice, for scores of 124 and 139. So, I guess technically we could say that Nick Dacos is averaging 137 points in his last 3 games at Marvel Stadium. That's a fact. This isn't necessarily a VC about targeting a good matchup, but it's more about picking a player who's in really hot form with a high Supercoach ceiling as a VC. And that form at Marvel Stadium, that probably will be enough to sway me to be using my VC on Nick this week. Another option here is a point of difference vice captain. And I think I would say vice captain this if you want to go for them rather than captain. I don't think I'd trust them with the captain. So I'm feeling a bit of pressure to give you another good pod VC this week after Jordan Dawson scored 158 and he was my pod captain recommendation last week. So I'm feeling a bit of pressure to get it right again. So I'm going to cheat a little here and recommend 2. But they are in the same team. They play the same position, so I'm going to allow it. These players are Max Holmes and Tom Stewart. It's no secret how bad Richmond are going this year or how many Supercoach points they're allowing to defenders. They are the single easiest matchup for defenders this year by a fair stretch. They are giving up huge numbers. They're especially leaky to attacking defenders, which Max Holmes is, and to designated kickers, which Tom Stewart is. Or if you are both of those things, like a Jordan Ridley or a Dane Zorko, a genuine 160-plus Supercoach score is at your disposal against Richmond. I could run through the list of defender scores against Richmond in recent weeks, but I've been doing that for about a month now. It's just repeating the same data. Instead, I'll tell you that Max Holmes and Tom Stewart are both averaging quite a bit more at GMHBA Stadium this year than they are away from it. And that's where they play this week. So what that means is whatever their season average, add a bit to it because they're doing better at GMHBA. I fully expect one of these guys to go 130 plus, Max Holmes or Tom Stewart. I expect one of them to spike. I'm just not sure which one it'll be. Which it could be both. There have been other teams that have had two defenders go big against Richmond, so they could both do it. My gut feeling is one of them goes big and the other's kind of just like a flat 100. So if you own one of them, it could be a nice pod VC to get a spike score that others really won't be considering. So absolutely consider Max Holmes and Tom Stewart as a point of difference. Now we go to my 5 captains, and pretty much all of these guys here, I'm just trying to net you a 120. There's not much big kind of 150s later in the week that I'm envisioning. So here's 5 options that I think could get you some safety if your VC fails. Number 5 is Jack Steele. Jack's not been in great form recently. He's got a 5-round average of 98. But if anything can kickstart you out of a funk, it's a matchup with the Eagles. They're currently the second easiest matchup for inside midfielders, and they've recently given up scores of 158 to Jordan Dawson, 124 to Clayton Oliver, 147 to Nick Dacos, and 147 to Scott Pendlebury. So if this game doesn't revive the man of steel, then I don't know what will. Jack only scored 86 against West Coast last year, but we know how hampered he was by injury in that season. Scores of 143 in 2022 and 150 in 2021 show what he can do when at his best. Will he be at his best this week? Your guess is as good as mine. But I do promise to give you 5 captain recommendations each week, so I've got to find you something. This one, it is scraping the bottom of the barrel, but any inside midfielder against the Eagles is worth at least thinking about. My number 4 option is Zach Merritt. Zach Merritt absolutely saved his score last week with a monster fourth quarter. He's actually done that a few times this year. And he's also had a couple where he started really hot in the first half and then faded out. We just need him to put it together for 4 quarters for a big score. This matchup was a very hard one at the start of the year, Gold Coast at home. I remember over their first month of the season, they were really restrictive. But lately, the Suns have been dropping off, and they're actually the 5th easiest midfield matchup over the last 5 games. Something I've noticed is that matchups don't really seem to be a predictor for Zach, though. He doesn't really take advantage of the bad teams, so he scored okay, but he didn't really take advantage of that Richmond, North Melbourne Eagles run that he had. And his biggest scores this year have actually been against Sydney, St Kilda and Port, and they're 3 hard teams. There's probably something in that. I don't really know what it is. My guess would be that he probably feels like he needs to lead from the front against the hard midfields and kind of shoulder the load. But maybe he kind of lets his younger teammates go up against the easier midfield matchups as a captain. I don't know if that is the case, but that's a trend I'm noticing, that he's scoring really well against the hard teams and just not punishing the weak teams. And actually, that's what Essendon do in general, so maybe it's just part of that. I don't know if that's the case. I'm just trying to find a reason. But anyway, despite their recent struggles, this Gold Coast midfield is formidable, with Rao, Anderson and Touk leading the way. I expect Merritt to be on his A game in this one to beat the Suns in Queensland. Even if the Suns are struggling, it's still a bit of a tough task going up there. So I expect Merritt to be firing 114, 136 and 107 in his last 3 games against them. And he does average over 100 at this ground, which he doesn't at all grounds. So I think there should be another one of those safe 120s that we're looking for this week. Now we'll go to my number 3 captain option, and that is the big dog, Max Gawn. Max Gawn has every chance to be the best player in SuperCoach this year. I mean, he's number 1 right now. He just keeps getting it done, and his 180 last weekend showed why he was my number 1 recommendation for round 11. Now, moving on to round 12, he's my number 3 recommendation. The plus side here is that Freo are the 2nd easiest matchup for Ruckman over the last 5 games, but that's not really accurate. The negative is that 2 of those were without Sean Darcy, and in those 2 games, Luke Jackson allowed big scores to Rowan Marshall and Brodie Grundy, which I think's really skewed the data. I don't think Freo are actually that easy to score against. I'll tell you why. Normally, I do avoid looking at Ruckman against Sean Darcy. He is the best tap Ruckman in the league. Darcy wins a hit out in over 50% of his ruck contests, which is a lot. Only he and Riley O'Brien are the only 2 players that win at least 50% of their ruck contests. And therefore, that makes Shrek a bit restrictive, or very restrictive. But he hasn't been kind of the restrictive Shrek of last year. With him being injured a lot, Sean Darcy this is, and he's been looking a bit out of form, there have been some good scores against him. So let's look at him. Sean Darcy's played 4 games this year. Tim English scored a 134 against him, and Darcy Cameron scored a 128 against him. So that's really good. But then Bailey Williams and Toby Nankervis got absolutely demolished against him. So it was kind of 50-50 at this stage. Gawn is good enough that he should be able to turn up against Freo, and I think he should be a safe captain option. I am recording this before teams are named. If Sean Darcy suffers another of his freak injuries and Luke Jackson is the solo ruck, then Max Gawn becomes my number 1 option, as Luke Jackson gives up big scores to Ruckman. But if Sean Darcy plays, I'll just leave Max here at number 3. One thing you might have noticed as well is that this game will be played at 1 p.m. in Alice Springs on Sunday. You might think it'll be too hot, slippery, humid, and players will fatigue. Well, I've checked the forecast for you. It's a maximum of 18 degrees on Sunday in Alice, so the weather should not be a factor. My number 2 captain option is Jeremy McGovern. Bit of out of the box one here, but I'm very confident. The Gov has done well against some hard matchups for defenders recently. Essendon, Melbourne and Adelaide do limit backmen, and he still averaged 111 in those games. In amongst that, he also scored 114 against Collingwood in only 47% game time. That was shaping up to be a huge one before the injury that sent him to hospital. Well, this week, we get a matchup with one of the easiest teams for defenders to score against. St Kilda are a very positive matchup for all 3 defender categories, and for Jeremy McGovern's play style, the designated kicker, St Kilda are actually the easiest matchup in the game. They're just easier than Richmond in that category, so awesome matchup. Some recent designated kicker scores against St Kilda include Stephen May scored 106, Jordan Clark scored 151, Luke Ryan scored 122, and Carl Amon scored 118, and Colby McKercher scored 135. So that's some giant scores for designated kickers against St Kilda in recent weeks. Normally, someone like Jeremy McGovern would only be a VC option for me. He wouldn't be someone that I'd normally trust with the captain just due to his ability to get injured. But I think given the dearth of other good options this week and his favourable matchup, I think you could vice captain or captain him. I'd be quite happy with either. Then my number 1 captain option is Caleb Serong. Caleb hasn't been in my captain recommendations for a few weeks, but that's because he's played 2 teams that are quite restrictive to inside midfielders. He still averaged 105 against those teams in those 2 games, but it gets much better this week. Playing against Melbourne, who were the 4th easiest matchup for inside midfielders over the last 5 games, this is a chance for Serong to get off the chain. So, as we said, playing the 4th easiest matchup, I think this is where he goes well. Caleb, one thing to note here, Caleb has never played in Alice Springs. In fact, as far as I can tell, he's never played an AFL game in the Northern Territory. So this is new territory for him, pun intended. What that means is we don't have any data on what he does up north. What we do have data on is recent midfielder scores against the Demons. Jack Steele scored 101, and we know he's not in form. Harley Reid scored 138. Tim Kelly scored 129. Patrick Cripps scored 132. Sam Walsh scored 119. And even some guys that aren't big high-scoring midfielders like Tom Atkins got a 113 and Thompson Dow scored a 110. So they're just some recent huge scores against Melbourne for inside midfielders. And I would argue that none of those players, maybe with the exception of Paddy Cripps, are of the calibre of player that Caleb Serong is. So I think this is a perfect Sunday captain option to bring it home with the safety of 120 in a weekend that might be hard to find something bigger than that. This one I think has the safety of 120 with a potential ceiling of, maybe getting up to 130, 140 even. So Caleb Serong is my number 1 captain option. As I said, I've got Caleb Serong, Jeremy McGovern, Max Gawn, Zach Merritt, and Jack Steele as my captains. I really like one of the Geelong boys to go off, either Max Holmes or Tom Stewart. I'm not sure which one it is, but you could have VC ping at either. And then for vice captains, these guys are probably all safe 120s, maybe not much more. Although Nick Dacos does always have a spike option, so Dacos, Bont and Butters are all options too. For me, I would love to vice captain Gawn into Serong, but they play each other, so I'm not going to do that. What I think I'll do instead, I think I'll vice captain Nick Dacos and hope he has one of his Marvel spike games. But if not, I'm pretty happy falling back on Caleb Serong as my captain. If I had Jeremy McGovern, I would love to do McGovern into Serong. I think that's a really, really nice option this week. I do own Tom Stewart, so I could do Stewart into Serong. I just like watching Tom Stewart last week, apart from that last 10 minutes, he's just not going very well. So I think it'll be Dacos into Serong for me. As always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Jump over to Twitter, follow me on @pig_DRSC. Subscribe to this, comment down below. I'll try and get to answer any comments. And if you're in the Dr. Supercoach Slack, hit me up there.